What's going on, guys, and welcome back to the Ashmore SCA Survivor YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about my sudden cardiac arrest that I suffered in December of 2018. Now, I don't know how this episode's going to go. It might get emotional. It's a hard thing for people to talk about. Some people can talk about their cardiac really easily. Some it's a lot harder. It's a lot more emotional. For me personally, I've told this story countless times over the 3.5 years since the event, but that still doesn't mean that it isn't going to get emotional for me. It's quite an event, quite a traumatic event, and every now and then I do get upset over it. But I think every cardiac survivor will tell you the same thing. So I suppose we best start with what I remember. Now, in terms of what I remember, I don't remember probably 2 weeks leading up to the cardiac itself. I remember the start of December. I remember meeting my partner at the time and forming that relationship. I remember I was going to the gym, eating well. I remember that sort of stuff. I don't remember the 2 weeks leading up to it. Not at all. Like, I'm trying to think now. I can't think of anything within those 2 weeks. The only thing I can remember from before the cardiac within those two weeks was just before I actually had the cardiac. I remember being in bed with my partner. We were talking or watching a film or something, and I remember saying, "Oh, I'm gonna go get me backy," because I smoked. And I remember standing up and I remember feeling dizzy. I remember saying, "Oh, I feel a little dizzy here." And my partner told me to sit down. So I sat down, and that's the last thing I remember before the actual cardiac or the start of the cardiac. I don't actually remember the cardiac itself. I don't remember the first week or so of recovery, maybe even more than that. So I can only the bit between me having the cardiac and the 3rd of January. The only thing I can remember in that is the hypoxic events, which I will go into further during the story. So a lot of it is filled in. It's only really the back end where I have the ICD and everything else that I can remember. So, yeah, so a lot of it is filled in, and please take that into account that I'm going to get some dates wrong. I'm going to get some events in the wrong order, maybe. But like I said, I've told this story to many friends and many people I meet so many times that I relatively can remember. I can relatively remember what happened in terms of what was filled in by other people and by doctors, family members, friends, all that were witness to it. So I want to start with a little bit of backstory, going back 10 years before I had the cardiac almost. I think I first started noticing I had chest pains, probably 15, maybe 16, maybe a little earlier, 14. And I'd get it occasionally, and it'd be like really tight, breathlessness. Looking back, I suppose that was probably a sign. It was never picked up by a doctor, but I can understand why it wasn't. I had severe anxiety. I have severe depression. I struggle with both of those daily. And when I went to the doctor, I went and saw them separately for each event. So I'd go to the doctor and I'd be like, right, I've got severe chest pain. I'm very anxious. So obviously they'd put it down to anxiety as to why I was getting this chest pain. And also same with depression and everything else. I later learned, much past the cardiac, that those three things, chest pain, anxiety and depression, were also signs of an impeding heart or cardiac sort of problem. Not always. I don't want you thinking, oh, I've got anxiety, I've got depression, I get chest pains every now and then. I don't want you thinking that you're going to have a cardiac arrest. I can't say you won't, but at the same time, I don't want you thinking that those were the things that caused it, because it wasn't that in the end that caused it. They were just symptoms, like with many other things, they were just symptoms of the eventual condition that was worked out as to what I had, and that actually caused the cardiac in the end. So, now that I've given you a bit of a backstory, so the depression, the anxiety, chest pains, weren't all the time. Depression was a lot more prevalent than, say, anxiety, although anxiety did become very prevalent in the 5 years beforehand. I remember I think it was my 18th, so probably 6 years beforehand. I remember my 18th birthday. I went to a family meal. Everyone got their carvery and whatever else, and I couldn't eat any of it. Like, I was that anxious with being in that setting, so many people, that I just couldn't cope. And I think it was my 18th. It might have been my 21st, thinking about it. I think it was my 21st. So yeah, it would have been within the 5 years. In fact, it would have been 3 years. And yeah, I was just so anxious. I had 2 mouthfuls of food, and that was it. I was in the toilets, I was throwing it up, I had to go outside, have a cigarette, calm myself down. And I never finished the meal. I don't remember finishing the meal. So, let's basically start. So, the cardiac, like I said, I don't remember the 2 weeks beforehand. I remember standing up. It would have been roughly around 1 a.m. in the morning on the 23rd of December, to get my baccy because I wanted a cigarette, and remember feeling dizzy, and I remember sitting down. Now, that is the last thing I remember. Everything else after this part is what's been filled in. I will then obviously say what the next thing I remember is when we get to that bit. So, I sat down, I then went into a seizure and started seizing quite badly. My partner at the time, she phoned 999, at which point I then stopped breathing. They advised her, in fact they told her, to get me down off the bed and onto the floor and to start CPR, which she did. She started CPR. During this time, the ambulance was on its way. I was probably the highest level that you can reach on the emergent, the critical. I don't know what they call it. I think it's critical. Was the highest priority. The ambulance on its way, where I used to live, there was basically on the roundabout, almost, and a bit up this road and a bit on the other side of the roundabout was one street. So it was under the same postcode, under the same name. Now, on the way, the ambulance turned off to go down the other side of the roundabout. And it weren't until they were directed back across over onto the roundabout and then up to where I actually was. So that lost me some time. In total, I believe I was, my partner was given CPR for 15 minutes. So I'd probably been down about 17 minutes by this point. When the ambulance arrived, it was quickly established that I was in cardiac arrest. I was paddled, came back first time, very successful in the way it came back. And they then obviously managed to get me up onto a gurney or whatever it is they use to get me down the stairs, out the flat, and into the ambulance. At that time, I had 2 ambulances and the fast response paramedic vehicle. I believe 3 paramedics were in the ambulance with me. So that would be the driver of the ambulance was obviously driving. That would have been his partner, the fast response unit paramedic, and the paramedic from the other ambulance. Now, the other ambulance, the driver stayed with my partner and took her up to hospital. I was blues and twoed all the way to the Royal Alexandra Hospital. I don't know whether I relapsed in the ambulance or whether I relapsed in the hospital. But I had to be paddled again, basically. And again, came back first time. But wasn't conscious, didn't really know what was going on. Obviously, completely unconscious. While I was down, receiving CPR from the partner, I had vomited, and because I was laying on my back, some of the vomit had made its way into my lungs, so I wasn't breathing properly, and as a result they had to put a line into my left lung, I believe, and when they put the line in, they accidentally punctured the lung. They went a little bit too far and punctured the lung. So at this point, I'm now in cardiac arrest, or had a cardiac arrest, and I now have a punctured lung as well. I was put onto a plethora of medication. My family obviously weren't allowed to see me for hours. I was in the ICU, completely unconscious, no idea. I was heavily sedated, not in a coma. I wasn't in a coma, I was heavily sedated. They're doing loads of different tests. As you can see, it's quite hard to talk about it. Memory isn't the best, so I'm struggling a little bit with memory. But we will get through it. Yeah, so I was having multiple medications. Obviously, my family had arrived and everything else, and they were going through the process of watching me basically fight for my life, which obviously was very distressing for them. Hooked up to loads of tubes. I had a breathing tube in, I don't know I think it was through my mouth. I remember apparently having loads of sores around my mouth at one point. Yeah, and basically I was on this plethora of medication. They were taking tests every couple of hours, going to the lab, test results coming back. Initially, they were just testing for everything. I was tested for meningitis, I was tested for HIV, I was tested for absolutely everything to try and find what had caused this cardiac arrest. Because initially they thought, mate, being so young, I'm a 24-year-old lad, so being so young at the time, they thought it was drug related. Tox results came back, no drugs. Then the big one was meningitis, so I had a lung puncture. Again, that came back negative for meningitis. And over the next couple of days, they just kept doing tests. Nothing seemed to be improving. I wasn't getting worse, but I wasn't getting better. I still wasn't awake at this point, so I think this is by end of Christmas Day, start of Boxing Day. I haven't woken up. I'm still down, so to speak, in terms of consciousness. They then basically decided to flush my system, and they described that process as domestos for the blood. It would kill literally everything. Good bacteria, bad bacteria, it would kill the lot. So they ran that through the system, and apparently, and judging by the fact I'm sat here, that made a hell of a difference. I went from this plethora of medication on the wall next to me to, I think it was 2 or 3 medications. It did a massive job. They then slowly started to bring me out of sedation, and obviously anyone that's been through that, or been through sedation, or any form of sedation, will know that you can be slightly aggressive when you come back out of it. Especially as a young male. Young males tend to be very aggressive, very violent. In which case I was. Obviously I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know anything about it. I was quite violent. Apparently I hit both my parents. I'd smacked a nurse in the throat, and ended up having to be resedated. They then tried to reawaken me the next day. Again, I was calmer, but I was still very much inappropriate, as they call it in the hospital. So inappropriate is basically you need to be able to understand and follow directions given to you by the nurse or the doctor. I wasn't in that position. I couldn't understand and couldn't follow doctor's orders. So I ended up under sedation again for another 24 hours. In which point, when they tried to bring me round, my parents were there. And while I wasn't responding to a nurse, I was responding to my mum. She was talking to me and I was listening to her commands and I was following her commands. But I wasn't doing it for the nurses. So I was still inappropriate in terms of listening and following the commands of the nurses. So again, they resedated me, not heavily. I was fighting it. I kept waking up, coming back round, and then being slowly put back into sedation and coming back out of it, and so on and so forth. The next day, I believe my parents got a phone call saying that I've come round from my station and I'm lucid, I'm following direction, and that was obviously a massive milestone. Only problem is, I don't remember any of this point. I don't remember any of this. So, I believed that my father had been killed in a car accident, I believed. I might be wrong with that, but I believe it was a car accident. Or he was a teacher or something. Like, really childlike, like 12 years old sort of mentality. And that was basically down to hypoxia. So hypoxia is obviously the starvation of oxygen within the brain. And what had happened was, because of all this starvation of oxygen and the sedation and everything else, my brain wasn't functioning properly. Obviously, it's lost a massive time as well. There were months, I believe, missing at this point. But obviously, like I said, I don't remember. This is what I have been told, that months were missing at certain points. Anyway, I then was moved to a room on my own. The reason I was moved to a room on my own was because I had started to hallucinate. So I was obviously seeing things and hearing things that weren't there. I remember my first hallucination, and I can remember it quite clearly, but the way people have told it back to me that were there, they have told me it's not how I remember. So I remember the person in the bed opposite me, I remember his last name, or a name, being Williams. And for some reason, I attributed that to motorbike racing. I don't know whether Williams was a motorbike racing person or company. I know there's the Williams Formula 1, but I don't know whether there is a motorbike one or not. So, because I'd attributed this to motorbike racing, what had happened was I was believing that this person opposite me, who, from what I can remember, is in a full body cast. You know, you see them in the movies and they've got their arms out, it's all cast down either arm, down the legs, they're in full body cast. This person was not like that. They were not like that, but in my head, that's what they were like. That's how I remember them. And they were sending me letters on how to build this super bike, to use castor oil and everything else. Now, when I've spoken to family members that know of this hallucination, that were there when this hallucination had happened, or I was telling them about that hallucination, they've told me that it was emails that I was receiving from this person. I don't remember emails. I remember letters. That was a very gentle movement into the hallucinations. That's the best way I can describe it, because the next hallucination was far worse. I believe this is the next hallucination anyway. It's the one I remember next. And that was and it's going to sound mad, but that was the nurses and the patients were having sex, and I was going to out them, and as a result, they were going to try and kill me. Now, as part of that hallucination, I had what I call a little friend. He was a human entity. He wasn't anything abnormal, to a degree. Right, sorry about that little break. The camera battery died, so I had to go and charge that. Gives me a little note to buy another camera battery. So where did we get to? We got to the humanoid entity that was part of the nurses and patients having sex sort of hallucination. So yeah, the human entity that was part of that hallucination was humanoid. He was human, except he was completely severed from the waist down. Spine was hanging out of his back, and he sort of crawled alongside me during that. Quite graphic, actually. When he died, so to speak, within the hallucination, that hallucination seemed to stop. But obviously, what that had caused was I'd been quite a bit of a handful for the nurses on the shift. This was obviously happening at night, where most of my hallucinations happened. So yeah, that was quite graphic and probably the most fear I've ever experienced in my entire life. Probably within my entire life. That hallucinations felt like it went on for days. It didn't. Apparently it was only a few hours, but it genuinely felt like days. That was seriously scary, that one. The next hallucination I can remember... In fact, I think there was a hallucination before the nurses and the patients one with the little human entity, the friend thing. I actually escaped the hospital. I believed I was hallucinating that the hospital was on fire, and basically I managed to get out one of the fire exits. They found me in the car park. I don't know how long I was out there. Managed to get me back in. I know I was in a separate room for a little while. I don't know how long I was in a separate room, but I was in a separate room for a little while. I think I had another lumbar puncture to rule out meningitis again, because I wanted to be doubly sure that wasn't the reason for the cardiac. Again, that came back completely negative, as did everything else. No HIV, nothing like that. It was all negative. So I was checked over by a neurologist at one point to check my mental stability, which obviously wasn't there at the time. I recited everything he spoke about. It went rather well. He said he was happy with the progress. Again, this is what I've been told. And basically, it was explained to my parents that your brain is like a jigsaw and everything fits into its proper place. And because of the hypoxia and the lack of oxygen and everything else, it was basically like this jigsaw that was in my brain had been thrown in the air and all the pieces were on the ground. And this was my brain going through each piece individually to find where they're supposed to go. So all these hallucinations were effectively what my brain was going through. So I know I had an hallucination regarding Luke Skywalker and the Millennium Falcon, and believing I was on the Millennium Falcon with Luke Skywalker. Well, obviously I'm a massive Star Wars fan, so that's probably where that one came from. I assume the Williams motorbike one, I assume that must have been from watching motorbike racing when I was a kid. I don't watch it so much no more, but I assume that's where that came from. Maybe the MotoGP, or I remember there was a game on the PS1, the PlayStation 1, that was a superbike racing game, and Castrol actually was on the front cover of that, on the bike that was on the front cover of that. So I'm assuming that's where that came from. So yeah, it's basically just putting everything back into place. The last hallucination that I do remember, because I only remember 3 of them, but the last one I remember, which I believe actually is the last hallucination I had, was the Small Soldiers were attacking the hospital. Now, Small Soldiers was a film back in the 90s, maybe early 2000s. In fact, I'm sure it was the 90s, where you had the Commandos and you had the Gorgonites. Commandos were the bad guys, Gorgonites were the good guys. They were toys, hence the name Toy Soldiers, and they had a bit of a war. I can't remember the film completely off the top of my head, but that's effectively the last hallucination. The Gorgonites, the good guys in the film, were attacking the hospital. My parents were called into that one. I'd ripped the headboard off my hospital bed, which is obviously screwed in, so how I managed that I don't know. And obviously it had to be forcibly removed from me by security. My parents were phoned up and arrived during that hallucination, and my old man took a photo of outside to show that there was nothing there. Well, obviously, I didn't believe that. Despite the photo, I didn't believe that. This was on the night of the 1st of January going into the 2nd. So this is past New Year now. We've gone past New Year. I don't remember completely everything about that night. I remember the toy soldiers. I remember that. And me and my mum got into a little bit of an altercation. I wanted to leave the room that I was staying in because obviously I'd been isolated away from the other patients because obviously I was disturbing them while they were trying to sleep. So I was in a little room on my own. And I got into a bit of an altercation with my mum. Apparently, I don't remember. And basically, she managed to get me to go to bed. Bearing in mind, I hadn't been properly asleep for a long period of time, probably 48 hours plus, I believe. Again, not 100% sure, but this is only what I've been told. And I remember sleeping, and I slept like 13 odd hours. Like, apparently I slept a hell of a long time. I woke up later that night, and they allowed me to phone my mum. I don't remember doing this, but I've seen the journal my mum wrote regarding that night, and yeah, in the journal it says that I phoned my parents and I was a lot clearer. I had more clarity. I could think properly, but I don't remember that. What I remember is waking up on January the 3rd, and basically I woke up and I was like looking around in this little room that I was in, and I was like, where am I? I'm not 100% on where I am. And I had a little peek through the glass in the door onto the ward, and I could see the nurses walking around and doing their thing. And I was like, well, I'm in hospital, I know that much. Not really sure why. Bearing in mind, I had been told during my lucid sections of the last couple of days that I'd had a cardiac and whatever else. But I didn't remember any of that. Do not remember any of that. So I call the 3rd of January. To family, it's the 2nd because that was the day I was first lucid. Completely. No hallucinations, no nothing. But to me, I don't remember the 2nd. I remember the 3rd. Do not remember the 2nd. And so obviously I'm confused. I walk out the at the little room. And I say to the nurse, like, where's the toilet? Because obviously I'd just woken up, I needed the loo. And she pointed me to the toilet. And I remember getting back into the little room and sort of sitting on the bed and going, I'm really confused as to what's happening. Why am I here? And about 20 minutes or so after that, the first nurse came in and said, look, this is what you ordered for breakfast yesterday. Don't remember doing it. I had to have a little injection into my stomach. Again, I don't know what that was. That I had to have pretty much every day I was lucid that I could remember. I'm assuming I'd been having it all week. But I'm not 100% what that was for. I didn't really question it because I was so confused at the time. And that was the day that they actually told me, where I can remember, that I'd had a cardiac arrest and that I'd been very poorly. I'd had pneumonia, obviously from the vomit being in the lungs, which had to be drained out over the course of several days. That I would need an ICD fitting. Obviously, my parents had already been told this. I think I'd been told, but I don't remember being told. So, obviously, all that. So that was a lot to take on. I weren't overly keen on having the ICD. I weren't too impressed with having it. I didn't like the idea of having an operation, especially one to do with the heart. Obviously, I didn't know the ins and outs of it, and I didn't completely understand how the operation would work. So I was relatively fearful and frightened of having that, I'll be honest. But eventually I did agree to it, and I had a load more days. So from the 3rd to about the 7th or 8th, I had a load more days where obviously I was just in the room on my own and very, very isolated from everyone else, which I didn't understand. I remembered the hallucinations, but I didn't understand why I was isolated on my own. I was very bored, very frustrated, quite snappy. I know I snapped at my parents quite a lot during that time period. Obviously still recovering. I'm still confused as to why I'm there. Like, okay, I've had this cardiac arrest, what does that mean? And it hadn't actually been told to me that the level of how lucky I was at the time. It was the 8th that they finally came around and gave me a consent form. I think it was the 8th or the 9th of January 2019 that they gave me the consent form. And initially, I didn't sign it. I didn't want to sign it. Like I said, I didn't want the operation to be done. I was very fearful of having it done. But I didn't understand it properly like I do now. Like, if they'd have told me exactly what was going to happen, they just basically said that this thing was going to be put into my chest and it was going to be connected to my heart. And if they'd have explained it fully, I think I'd have been a lot more open to it. But yeah, to begin with, I really wasn't open to having the ITD. And a nurse spoke to me about it and explained why I need to have it and obviously the pros and cons of it and everything else. And eventually she got me to agree to have the ICD. I signed the consent form, and on the 10th of January I was awoken at 5:30 to be taken to another hospital that could actually do the ICD implantation. So I think it was about 6:30, 7 o'clock, I was in the ambulance and I was off to this other hospital. I was nervous, anxious, I was feeling travel sick on top because obviously I was sat in the ambulance and the ambulance is going one way and I'm facing the other. And I suffer with travel sickness anyway. So going backwards, not being able to see anything really out of the ambulance, it was quite disorientating, made me feel quite ill. Yeah, so I arrived at the other hospital and they eventually took me down to my to my operation. I think my operation was booked in for 10:30, I want to say. Maybe 10 o'clock. And they said, like, it's going to be a 40-minute operation. We're going to, obviously, cut your ear on your chest. We're going to feed 2 wires down into your heart, one into the top chamber, one into the bottom chamber. And then we will obviously fit in the ICD itself, connect all the wires up, close you back up, job's done. You're going to be sedated, which I thought was great. It means I wasn't going to feel it, I wasn't going to know about it too much. Because obviously that was a big worry, being awake, because they initially told me I'd be awake for it. But the minute they put the sedation in, I was gone. I was out. Unfortunately, they had problems connecting one of the wires into my heart, and as a result, the operation ran a little bit longer than it should have. So I eventually woke up and the sedation started to wear off. I see the doctor's head poke up over the little, and they put like a little curtain across your face. I saw his head sort of pop up over the top, and basically say, "We're nearly done, we're not done yet. We've just got to put the stitches in." Oh, that's alright, they numb the area, I'm not going to feel it. Oh boy, was I wrong. I felt every stitch going while I'm laying on this table, not being able to move. Yeah, so they put the stitches in, they cleaned it up, they put the protective covering on it, the protective bandages and whatever. And I walked out the operating theatre. They thought they were going to have to wheel me back, but obviously never had to, because I'd woke up and I was able to walk. So I walked out the operating theatre, and don't know if you've had an operation, but you're not allowed to walk to or from the operation, or at least you're not with this one. I don't think you are with any operation nowadays in the UK. So obviously I'd walked out the operating theatre and then had to sit in a wheelchair to go back to the ward I was supposed to be on. I was back on the ward, I think by about 11 o'clock, 10 past 11, something like that. I then had to wait till 6:30 p.m. for an ambulance to come and get me, to take me back to the Alexandra. I eventually got back to the Alexandra. I had did I have an ECG on overnight? Or was that the night before? That was the night before. I had the heart monitor on. And some point by me wearing this heart monitor over the night before or during the rest of the week, 2 weeks that I'd been there, they picked up on a little anomaly in my heartbeat, and every now and then my heart either skips a beat or does a double beat. I think it skips a beat. Where the bottom chamber, so you've got the 2 chambers, the bottom chamber doesn't pump properly. And it was decided that the reason that I'd had my cardiac arrest was down to ventricular fibrillation, which is obviously the bottom one, spasming. So they obviously eventually found the cause to it, and it was even more important that I'd had the ICD, because obviously it's more likely to happen again with arrhythmia of any kind, be that atricular or ventricular. So it was good to know a cause of the cardiac. They believed I probably had this arrhythmia my entire life, and they don't believe it was brought on by anything. So it would explain the chest pain in the younger stages of my life. It would explain that massively. And also the anxiety and the depression that are very common symptoms with an arrhythmia. So it was nice to have something solid that basically said, this is the reason. You weren't just unlucky, sort of thing. Which was obviously massive for the recovery. And yeah, so I get back to the Alexandra, go to bed for the night, and I finally get discharged on the 11th of January 2019. So I spent, 19 days roughly in hospital after the cardiac arrest, which is not as long as some people, but longer than others. And I think, to be honest, personally that if I hadn't been hypoxic and suffered the hallucinations, I wouldn't have been in there half as long as I was. I think the hypoxia was a major cause of being in there as long as I was. So, yeah, that's the cardiac story in a nutshell. I'm not going to go into any of my recovery phase or my PTSD or anything like that. That's going to be for another video, because I think this one's going to be long enough as it is. So I don't really want to, go through that sort of stuff and make this video way too long, because I already feel like I'm going to have to edit it down in terms of little breaks, and obviously I had the camera issue and stuff like that. So I don't want to make this video too long. Next week, I don't know what I'm going to be doing. I know this week was the World Arrhythmia week, and I thought about putting off this video to do an arrhythmia video, but with the arrhythmia video, I would need you to know the background behind my cardiac. So this video needs to come out first before I can do another arrhythmia video, or in particular my arrhythmia video to do with ventricular. So yeah, I decided this was the best way to go. So next week, I don't know what I'm going to be doing. It's probably going to be an arrhythmia video, or it's going to be a recovery phase video. It might be an interview with a survivor or somebody that helped them. I don't know what next week's going to hold. Hopefully, you've enjoyed the video though, and it's given you a bit of an insight into my cardiac arrest itself. And yeah, hopefully you can learn something from it. And if you've had a cardiac yourself, by all means, drop it in the comments below and tell me your story. I'd love to hear about your story. Yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up the video. And if anyone's a survivor and they want to do a little interview over Zoom or whatever, I've never used Zoom, Discord, anything like that, then again, drop it down in the comments below. It'd be great to talk to another survivor. And yeah, that's that. I'll see you next week for another episode.